that I didn't expect to learn when researching Britain in the 1940s and Halloween, it's this. Welcome to the witches of World War II. Yep, you heard that correct. Witches fought the Germans in World War II. Apologies for the change of location. My mum would absolutely not let me film a YouTube on my own in the woods. To be fair, I can't really blame her. And because the rain absolutely destroyed my hair, we've gone for a kind of Little My-esque bun. If anybody knows who Little My is, you have all of my respect. But yes, if you want a spooky tale that is absolutely historically factual, then grab a hot drink and cozy up. And I want to preface this video by saying, although we're talking about witches and magic and a bit of spooky history for this Halloween, we are also talking about World War II from both sides, so this is a trigger warning for you. But allow me to make myself clear, I am not talking about the night witches, the daring female pilots who bombed the Germans under the dark of night. I'm talking about actual witches with spells and naked moonlight dancers. But it does feel wrong to me on this week of All Hallows Eve to not take a moment to commemorate the night witches and learn how truly amazing they really were. So before we get spooky, let's give them the spotlight for just a moment. Because these women flew under the cover of darkness in bare bones plywood biplanes, braving frostbite and bullets whilst battling scepticism and sexual harassment on the ground. So feared were they by the Nazis that any German airman who downed one was awarded the prestigious Iron Cross Medal. The Germans nicknamed them Nachtshexen, or night witches, because of the whooshing sound that their wooden planes would make as they flew by, which allegedly resembled that of a sweeping broom. And that sound is the only warning that the Germans had of their approach, because the planes were too small to be picked up on radar, and because they didn't use radios, radio locators couldn't pick them up either. So they were basically ghosts. But using female pilots wasn't the first choice, and women were actually banned from combat. But with the pressure of an encroaching enemy, Soviet leaders were forced to have a rethink. And on June 28, 1942, the 588th Squadron took aim successfully at the headquarters of the invading Nazi forces. The squadron itself was the brainchild of Marina Raskova, who was known as the Soviet Amelia Earhart. She had been receiving letters from all across the Soviet Union from women wanting to join the war effort, and although they were allowed to participate in supporting roles, many of them wanted to be gunners and pilots. A lot of them had lost brothers and sweethearts and seen their homes completely ravaged. And so Raskova petitioned Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin to allow her to form an all-female fighting squad. And on October 8, 1941, Stalin gave the orders to deploy 3 all-female Air Force units, making the Soviet Union the first nation to officially allow women to engage in combat. Most were students ranging from 17 to 26 years old, and they underwent compressed, extensive training, expected to learn in just a few months what it took some soldiers several years to grasp. The weight of their bombs in their much lighter aircraft forced them to fly at lower altitudes, which made them a very easy target. Hence, their missions only took place at night. And this was their tactic. The first planes would go in as bait, attracting German spotlights. They rarely had ammunition to defend themselves, and they would release a flare to light up the intended target. The last plane would idle its engines and glide in darkness to the bombing area. And it was this stealth mode that created their signature witch's broom sound. Altogether, these daredevil heroines flew over 30,000 missions. They lost 30 pilots, and 24 of them were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. 6 months after the war ended, the regiment was disbanded, and during the Moscow Victory Day parade, they weren't included because their planes were too slow. Well, ladies, at least by me, your bravery has not gone unnoticed. But what about occult witches, or Britain's secret spooky weapon? Well, it all started when Gerald Gardner, a British occultist, joined the New Forest Coven in 1939, and he became known as the father of witchcraft, writing many books that would form the foundations of Gardnerian Wicca. Gardnerian Wicca. And in the year 1940, he led a spell to target the German dictator. Gardner grew up in a wealthy English family that ran a timber company for the British Empire. But he was a sickly boy and would spend more time with his nursemaid than he would with his parents. He spent much of his young life travelling and educating himself and built up a keen interest in spirituality, religious rituals and the occult. He would return to Britain as an older gentleman, still sickly, but took up a career as a civil servant and amateur archaeologist. Meanwhile, his interest in the occult only grew. After Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, Gardner settled in Highcliffe-on-Sea and joined the New Forest Coven, a group of pagan witches in southern England who he believed were continuing a pre-Christian religious order that had been kept secret for centuries. And as 1939 turned into 1940, Gardner's affection for his coven grew, as did the coven itself. They practiced folk magic in tune with their beliefs, and Gardner began writing a series of books which would form the foundation of the brand of Wicca that still bears his name. But by this point, Germany had captured its objectives in Poland, had conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, and were pushing further into France, with hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers having to be evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. And although a 55-year-old Wiccan, Gardner was still a patriotic Brit and wanted to do his part to end the threat of invasion. And he did it in the only way that he knew how. You see, the Prime Minister Winston Churchill has said that people need to brace themselves to their duties, and Gardner became an air raid warden, and his home was a headquarters for air raid precautions. He also joined the local Home Guard as an armourer, providing locals with weapons from his own collection of firearms and preparing Molotov cocktails for use in combat. But Gardner wanted to do more, and allegedly the New Forest Coven had a ritual that had been used twice before to defend the British Isles, once in 1588 against the Spanish Armada, and then again in 1805 against Napoleon, and it was called the Cone of Power. And on August 1st, 1940, during the Lammas Eve Harvest Festival, Gardner and his coven met in New Forest, just north of Highcliffe, around an ancient hangman's tree called the Naked Man. They walked to Ferny Knapp Enclosure, a wooded area where the ritual would take place. And instead of using a traditional bonfire, the witches opted for a shuttered lantern. I mean, after all, Gardner was still an air raid warden, and they danced in a spiral whilst sky-clad to generate enough magical energy to form the cone. As the coven chanted and danced, Gardner invoked the words of the spell to be directed towards Hitler's brain to cloud his judgment, weaken his resolve, and hasten his downfall. They chanted, "You cannot cross the sea, you cannot cross the sea, you cannot come, you cannot come," with some of the frailer witches putting so much energy into the ritual that they dropped down dead. Now, believe what you will, but roughly 6 weeks after the Cone of Power, Hitler abruptly cancelled Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain, in favour of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And less than a year later, Hitler invaded the USSR and declared war on the United States, two critical miscalculations that would have disastrous consequences for him. To Gerald Gardner and the New Forest Coven, it was proof once again that the Cone of Power had saved Britain. But that still wasn't it for the New Forest witches, because during D-Day they allegedly performed an enormous act of weather magic, sending a powerful storm which confounded the Germans and enabled the Allies to land undetected at Normandy. Apparently, a number of the witches even died as a result of the power that was unleashed. And a break in the weather was critical to the success of Operation Overlord, which was codename for the Battle of Normandy. And what happened to Gardner? Well, in 1964, 79-year-old Gardner, whilst travelling home from Lebanon, suffered a fatal heart attack and was buried in Tunisia, the ship's next port of call, and the only person that attended his funeral was the ship's captain. He bequeathed a museum all of his artefacts and the copyright to his books to one of his high priestesses, but she and her husband sold off the collection to the American Ripley's Believe It or Not organisation several years later. And several years later, a Wiccan high priestess went in search of Gardner's grave, and when she realised that it was going to be redeveloped, she raised money for his body to be moved to another cemetery in Tunis, where it currently remains. And in 2007, a new plaque was attached to his grave that read, "Father of modern Wicca, beloved of the great goddess. But the thing is, it wasn't just Britain that believed that they could use the power of the craft. The Germans believed it too. And that brings me on to the goddess of the devil, Hitler's medium. And what the Third Reich believed is kind of insane, because they had an intense interest in parapsychology, firmly believing that the Aryan race descended from aliens who established Atlantis, that the devil was really the good guy, and that werewolves protected clean living Germans against ravagers from Slavic vampires. They also had an obsession with the Holy Grail, witchcraft, anti-gravity machines, and astrology. And here's where the German dictator's interest spiked. In 1909, George Lance wrote doctrines that prophesied the resurgence of a lost Aryan civilization called Godmen, and gave some of his magazines to a young man named Adolf Hitler. It was believed that witches were earth mothers and practitioners of a traditional Germanic religion that Judeo-Christianity tried to eradicate. Millions of Germans were convinced that they were the chosen people, and that the downfall of 1918 would be reversed by Hitler's ability to make the impossible possible. Hitler even allegedly studied Ernst Schertl's Magic as a self-help manual, underlining passages like, "He who does not carry demonic seeds within him will never give birth to a new world." It's actually terrifying, isn't it? But Hitler turned against astrology, tarot reading, and all commercial uses of the supernatural in fear that these could be used to manipulate the public outside of his control. Even professional magicians were legally compelled to demonstrate how their tricks were accomplished. But Hitler and his inner circle continued to firmly support scientific occultism. And then Mr. Hitler connected with Maria Orsic, a woman of outstanding beauty and a member of the Shadow Vril Society, which prospered during the formation and rise of Germany's Third Reich. Accused by some of being an evil goddess or the devil's angel, her society was entertained by the Nazis because she was alleged to have the power to communicate with extraterrestrials from the Aldebaran solar system using her long hair that acted as an antenna. This is just insane. It's genuinely insane. Maria's father was a Croatian immigrant while her mother was Austrian, and she connected with Karl Haushofer, a German professor in 1917 of the Thule Society, a German occultist group founded in Munich shortly after World War I. And then Maria started her own female medium, and they all had long ponytails that they believed acted as cosmic antennas to receive alien communication. And in 1919, a few members of all these secret societies met at a small alpine lodge. There, Maria and another medium by the name of Sigrun claimed to have received telepathic transmissions from Aldebaran Star in a secret Templar writing containing technical blueprints for the construction of flying machines. Her mysterious drawings launched the search for new energy forms and resulted in experiments to manipulate gravity, space, and time. She was eventually asked to put together a flying machine superior to anything else known on Earth, and this was called the Die Glocke, or the Bell. Die Glocke was allegedly invented by Nazi scientists helped by Jewish prisoners as a way to travel through time and space using anti-gravitational science. It was built in the underground facilities of Der Reich and was made out of a hard, heavy metal approximately 9 feet wide and 12 to 15 feet high, with a shape similar to that of a large bell. The anti-gravitational effect was reached by 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with a mercury-like substance. However, Maria and her close female followers, all with their floor-length long hair, disappeared without a trace sometime in 1944. Plans for the Bell project were found and prototypes were partially constructed. Some believe that Maria and her female entourage fled back to the Aldebaran solar system, and she did leave behind a letter to all members of the lodge which read, "No one stays here." It is actually speculated that her and her female followers escaped to Nazi Antarctica, which is a lot closer than Aldebaran. Whatever you may believe, I find these niche parts of history incredibly fascinating and also terrifying, and not for the obvious reasons. I mean, to think that a world war was raging whilst women were dancing naked in the moonlight and flying machines were being constructed is... I actually can't wrap my head around it. But there you have it. Witches in World War II. Not exactly bedknobs and broomsticks, is it?